The Fire Spirit may seem like a card that lacks a unique attribute and has a boring history because of its simplicity, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Although it may seem like nothing special today, it's had a crazy history, and I'd say other than the Heal Spirit, this card is more different from its vanilla release than any other card in the game. You wouldn't think a card like this could have been so problematic to the point where the developers felt the need to give it major overhauls over the years, but it's been in the game for 8 years, and sometimes with a new environment, certain cards just don't fit in the same way they used to. So let's talk about the Fire Spirit's past in Clash Royale, cover all the balance changes it's received over the years, and explain why this card got the overhauls that it did. The Fire Spirits were originally released on May 3rd, 2016. A time where new cards were actually added. It was released among 5 other cards, one of which was a new spawner building, the Furnace, which spawned Fire Spirits. Although we will certainly be bringing up the Furnace in this video, we're going to prioritize talking about only the Fire Spirits card. And yes, I am saying Fire Spirits plural because back in 2016, this used to be a swarm card of 3 spirits instead of 1, and it cost 2 elixir upon release. This troop was very unique back in the day, because it was the only troop that died as a result of its attack. This troop had a very unique attack where it would jump onto its target, dealing 1 burst of damage before disappearing. They were also very fragile, dying to any damage-dealing spell, even something as light as the Zap. And they were the only swarm card in the game to deal splash damage. So what was the card's purpose at the time? Well, it was sort of a competitor to the Zap, because it was used in a lot of situations a Zap could be used. For example, it was great against Skeleton Army and Goblin Barrel for a +2 positive elixir trade, since they were 4 elixir back then. But unlike the Zap, they could fully take out minions or a princess. The fact that they could take out minions was especially beneficial because at the time, nearly every deck had either minions or minion horde, and arrows were really slow. On top of these perks, they could also be used to get a nice amount of chip damage on the tower. However, because they died in 2 tower shots, only 2 of the 3 would reach the tower if unsupported. But even that was 338 damage at level 9, which is about what a lightning would do. Fun fact about this, the Fire Spirit was the only troop that dealt more damage than health it had. Well, except for Sparky, but she was changed later to where that wouldn't be the case anymore. Because the Fire Spirits did so much damage for their cost, they were really good at dealing with Barbarians, Mini P.E.K.K.A, and even 3 Musketeers if you combined it with a Zap. The value you could get from these guys was insane. But of course, since they were so fragile, the damage was never guaranteed. It added a nice risk-reward factor unlike anything we had really seen before. This fragility was their biggest weakness though. If they didn't jump on anything, it was usually a complete waste of elixir. Since this card had such a unique function, they were widely regarded as being a great addition. They weren't useless, but not game-breaking either. It certainly wasn't considered to be toxic or problematic, but since this card shared a troop with the Furnace, there were obviously going to be some challenges long-term when it came to balancing. But right now, that wasn't a huge issue, because both cards were sort of underwhelming upon release. A few days after the card's release, in Top Ladder, the Fire Spirits were used in about 10% of decks, which was slightly below average for the time. But I never like to use rates just after a card's release to determine a card's strength, because the meta takes time to develop, and likely not everyone had them leveled up yet. As the time passed, however, the spirits appeared to be not as great as they once seemed. Their main problem seemed to be that they just weren't consistent. They often had difficulties hitting all the troops in a clump, which is what they were supposed to do. The Furnace was pretty underwhelming as well, so Supercell wasted no time. In the first set of balance changes since their release, on May 18th, 2016, Supercell would give the spirits their very first change. Their splash radius would be increased from 1.2 to 1.5 tiles. This change really helped it to hit more troops in a clump and just be more consistent against minion hordes and barbarians. Its first balance change would actually be the last balance change it would receive for a very long time, which makes sense because it was a card that shared a troop. The Furnace was more of a balancing issue, so Supercell would be working on that card for a while in a way that didn't affect the Fire Spirit card. A few days after this buff, the Fire Spirits were only being used by a single top ladder player. They just were not appealing in the current environment. Zap was still really popular around this time and did pretty much everything you would need Fire Spirits for, but it was much safer. The main problem seemed to be now was that the spirits did not offer enough reward for the risk they required. And on top of that, the Zap had only been gaining popularity throughout 2016, making it even more difficult for these fragile fireballs to survive long enough to jump on anything. Especially in the coming months, when we had cards like the Ice Spirit come out, which had very similar mechanics to the Fire Spirit and could kill all three of them with its attack for a positive elixir trade, as well as the Ice Golem, which could absorb all of the spirits for an equal trade. As the months went by, it really seemed like Supercell had abandoned the Fire Spirits so quickly. They got one small tweak a couple of weeks after they were released, and that was it. They never had good rates and were hardly ever seen in competitive environments, which is why it would be very surprising when in October 2016, the card would suddenly rise to being used in 17% of top ladder decks with no balance changes. It was now appearing in the second most popular deck in top ladder. Expo had a sudden rise in this period, and it turns out the spirits worked very well with it. They had finally found a place. The game was transitioning from a very heavy beatdown, more specifically giant poison meta, giving more room for cycle decks like Expo to breathe. Unfortunately for the Spirit Squad, Expo was developing fast, and the spirits were replaced as fast as they were included. Because not even a month since that stat was taken, the spirits use rate in top ladder was back down to 1%. Around the start of December though, they would surprisingly have another small resurgence, not in Expo, but in Royal Giant Siege. This deck briefly rose to being the #1 most used deck in top ladder. Unfortunately though, like with the Expo, the popularity wouldn't last. Before the month was even over, their popularity had fallen again. Although it was still being seen in Royal Giant as a whole just wasn't as prominent by the end of the month, partly thanks to the newly buffed Elite Barbarians. And the Elite Barbarians may have been a big reason as to why the Fire Spirits weren't getting buffed anytime soon. You see, Elite Barbarians plus Fire Spirits would soon become a very popular combo, but it wasn't really something you would see together if you looked at the top meta decks from around this time, meaning it was a mid-ladder player's nightmare to see them together. This became a deadly combo that players instantly hated. They were both very fast, and the Fire Spirits complemented the E-Barbs so well. This was not a good place to be in, because when a card is really prominent in lower ladder but unused in the most competitive environments, that card will typically not receive any love from the developers. Even if Fire Spirits were having a tough time finding a consistent niche though, the important thing is they were showing potential. They may not have had the best rates, but they weren't ignored when it came to designing the best decks. In the right environment, they certainly could thrive, and that wasn't necessarily a bad place for a card to be in. The Spirits rates would continue to fluctuate going into 2017, and throughout the entire year, Supercell would take a relaxed approach, observing how they would adapt to the changing environment without any direct interference. January was an awful month for it. Almost nobody was using it, but in February, that number jumped to 23%. This was mostly thanks to the meta becoming more bait-centered. The Zap had just received a substantial nerf, which ultimately caused this meta shift. Although Zap could no longer fully counter the Goblin Barrel at equal level, the Fire Spirits still could for the same cost. Also because of the Zap's decline in popularity, the Fire Spirits were getting wiped away instantly less often. The Zap nerf really allowed fragile cards like the Fire Spirits to thrive. This is why the Fire Spirits gained more popularity than any other card following the Zap nerf. It really just goes to show how one card can completely hold back another card. Spellbait decks were trending around this time, so it's no surprise that the most popular decks Fire Spirits were appearing in were decks of that archetype. But now you were even seeing them back in Expo and Royal Giant, as well as seeing it included in the most popular Hog Rider deck. And the following month, you started to see it being used frequently with the Three Musketeers, but like its previous uprises, this wouldn't last. Over the next few months, Spellbait, Hog Rider, and Royal Giant Siege decks would go on to evolve, removing the Fire Spirits altogether. Part of this could have just been people experimenting with other options, since it was widely believed for a brief period that the Zap was a dead card. The only decks that really kept them for a while were the Expo ones, but by May, even Expo pretty much abandoned them. They were right back at the bottom once again. And that's pretty much where they would stay for the rest of 2017. They would still be used in competitive play, but very rarely, and they almost never made it in any of the top decks. I don't think it'd be fair to say they were useless, but they just couldn't thrive in most environments. Like, they were really good against certain decks, but then against others, they were borderline useless. There were just always better options. Deciding what to do with this card was very tricky. If you buffed them, that could potentially make them overpowered, since they already had the potential to perform well in the right climate. Plus, even a small buff to the Fire Spirit troop would have a drastic impact on the Furnace. A buff that would make the Fire Spirit's card balanced could make the Furnace a nightmare, and Supercell definitely did not want to encourage a heavy spawner meta. Even going into 2018 though, the rates of Fire Spirits remained as low as ever. Supercell was smartly patient with them given their unpredictable nature, but observing their performance throughout 2018, it's clear that they weren't having another resurgence. And soon enough, a full year had gone by with them consistently having subpar rates. So finally, in July 2018, Supercell would give the Fire Spirits the first buff they would get in over 2 years. The Furnace and Fire Spirits were both underwhelming by this point, so a direct buff to the Fire Spirit troop made more sense now. It was dangerous to give them even a small buff though, since their history shows us that their place in the meta isn't as stable as most cards. So they would simply get a damage buff of 5%. It still wouldn't do quite as much as a Fireball if you combined all three of them, but it was at least enough to fully take out a Flying Machine now. Even with this help though, the Fire Spirits were still stagnating. They were really only ever used in very niche cycle decks, and it didn't even really thrive in those few decks. It certainly didn't help that more small spells were added this same year. The Barbarian Barrel and Snowball were both new 2 elixir spells, which only provided more competition in the niche that the Fire Spirits were supposedly trying to fill. They were simply more reliable and just better in most situations, and despite them having really high use rates, they wouldn't be getting nerfs. At least nothing major. Seth, who was the community manager, even confirmed later that they were actually trying to get all 4 spells to have a 25% use rate, which is about 3 times what the average card had. And of course, not only was that some tough competition, but all 4 spells destroyed the trio of spirits for an equal trade. Now, I want to cover a bit more in depth as to why the spirits were in such a tricky position. You see, with swarm cards, you're able to split them so that the opponent can't wipe them all out with a single spell. Although you could certainly split the spirits, a single one on its own was practically harmless. So you really only had to worry about taking out 2 of them. No other card was quite like this. A single minion or a couple of bats also wouldn't do any damage if unsupported, but at least they were immune to logs and barbarian barrels. So it wasn't as necessary to split them to avoid giving spell value. This is very similar to the guards as well. A single guard is pointless, but since they had shields, they couldn't be wiped out by a single spell. So you didn't need to split them to avoid giving massive spell value either. The point is, every other 2 or more elixir swarm card could either split pressure or resist at least some of the 2 elixir spells. This is partly why the spirits were at such a disadvantage. And that's not even all. A lot of the cards Fire Spirits used to be able to counter for a +2 positive elixir trade were changed drastically. Goblin Barrel and Skeleton Army used to be 4 elixir, but now they were only 3. So there just wasn't as much gain to be had there anymore. But hey, Fire Spirits could still counter Minion Horde for a pretty big trade. That's always been true. And no 2 elixir spell could completely take minions out. However, the arrows could. As I already stated, the arrows weren't that great of a counter to minions in 2016 due to their slowness, but that was changed over the years with the arrows receiving multiple speed buffs. So if minions were your problem, you would just pick arrows. All of this is why I think Fire Spirits had a really tough time fitting in. And sure, there were some niche situations where Fire Spirits could really shine, but these kinds of situations realistically never happened in game. The climate had just evolved so much to the point where they were completely boxed out. Having this problem combined with the problem of trying to keep the furnace balanced seemed to be a balancing nightmare. One suggestion I heard was adding a fourth unit. That way, you could split them 2 and 2 and both sides would be able to chip the tower if unanswered. But if that's what you wanted to go for, you would have to leave the health and jump range the same, which leaves the damage and splash radius stats to mess with. Because adding a 4th spirit alone would likely make the card too strong, so something would have had to have been toned down. But then how would you ensure that the furnace is balanced? Would it spawn 3 spirits per wave? Would you give it so much extra health that it was more of a wall than a source of offensive pressure? It was just such a complicated situation that easily could have spiraled into chaos if the team wasn't careful. 2019 was a terrible year for the Fire Spirits. The card was not being acknowledged whatsoever anymore, and it did not receive a balance change the entire year, and the rates practically stayed the same throughout it. The year wasn't a total flounder though. In April and May, this log bait deck performed pretty well. The Fire Spirits acted as a useful bait card in this specific deck. It wasn't a super popular deck, but it did reach the top ladder leaderboards, even pushing to the #1 spot globally, proving they still had some potential, so I thought it was worth acknowledging. But just because a few players were having brief success with them didn't detract from the notion that they needed a buff. Later in the year, Seth did actually mention a potential Fire Spirits rework in an interview held in October 2019.
You want game mechanics to feel unique to each element. So for example, every lightning card should stun. So what is fire's mechanic? And one thing we were thinking about is that maybe fire has the largest splash radius, like all fire cards sort of have this large radius, and so that would be something we could do to wizard and fire spirits.
He mentioned he wanted to increase the radius, but didn't claim it would be a buff, but rather used the word rework. Since he didn't say what stat would be nerfed to compensate, it was apparent that there wasn't any plan to change the troop anytime soon. The Spirit Trio's poor performance unsurprisingly continued throughout 2020, consistently remaining in the bottom 10 winning cards, if not bottom 5. Months continued to go by without any further changes, until June 2020, where they actually received a nerf. That's right, a nerf. It was just a standardization change being applied to all swarm cards. They would now have a staggered deploy time of 1/10 of a second. So instead of all 3 spirits being ready to attack in exactly 1 second after deployment, one of them would take 1.1 seconds and the last one would take 1.2 seconds. Ultimately, this didn't hurt the Fire Spirits that much, but it's not like they were able to go down much more than they already were anyway. However, 1 month before this change, the Furnace was nerfed. And while responding to some criticism of that balance change, Seth commented that the team was looking at ideas for Fire Spirits, so it was confirmed that they were at least on the balancing radar, which means a change in the foreseeable future seemed likely. And that assumption would be correct, because in September 2020, the Fire Spirits would finally receive another buff. This was a small radius buff of 2/10 of a tile, exactly what Seth had suggested about a year earlier. On the day before this buff went live, the win rate was at 23%, the 4th lowest in the game. So this small of a buff didn't seem like it would bring the card up that much. And it turns out, Supercell even knew this to an extent, because they left a very interesting message in the balance changes in regards to Fire Spirits, proving they weren't done changing it. They stated, "Fire Spirits have been in need for love for a while. In an ideal world, we eventually want to rework the current Fire Spirits to be a solo spirit, similar to other spirits. But because Fire Spirits are tied to Furnace, it gets tricky. While we are prototyping this single Fire Spirit, we thought it would be nice to make the current Fire Spirits and Furnace viable again with an area damage radius buff." The Ice Spirit and Heal Spirit were both very similar in terms of health and damage, they just had slight differences in their abilities. And they were both fairly healthy cards. The Fire Spirits were the original spirits in Clash Royale, present before any other type. But they were different, and it was clear that it wouldn't be until Supercell released future spirits like the Ice and Heal Spirit to really understand the best way for the spirit mechanic to work. Fire Spirits were outclassed and outdated, and it would only be a matter of time before the card as we knew it would be no more. So at this point, we knew a rework was coming, but it wasn't known when. Since they had just given it a radius buff, it was safe to assume that it would be a while before the single fire spirit was implemented. In the meantime though, did this small radius buff make any difference in the spirit's performance? Well, if we check the rates exactly 1 week after the buff, it seemed to be doing better, but they still weren't appearing in any top decks. And if we fast forward a bit more, the rates were right back down towards what they were before the buff. So ultimately, it was a meaningless buff that didn't bring the card back in any significant way. Over the next few months, Fire Spirit's already low win rate would fall even further, eventually having the lowest win rate in all of Clash Royale. Worse than even the Wizard. Months would go by, and multiple sets of balance changes would happen with no further sign on the Fire Spirit rework, until June 2021, 9 months after it was teased. And this is easily one of the biggest reworks a card has ever received in all of Clash Royale history. The Fire Spirits were in total receiving 6 changes, the most notable and important change being that they were no longer the Fire Spirits, but rather the Fire Spirit, which of course we already knew. To compensate for 2 less units, the elixir cost was dropped to 1 elixir, its damage was increased by 6%, meaning it took out lava pups now. Its hit points were more than doubled to match the ice spirits, meaning just 1 fire spirit could connect to the princess tower on its own now. Its jump range was increased by half a tile, so more slow attacking ranged cards like Bowler would get hit in a one-on-one interaction. And its area radius was increased by 0.8 of a tile, meaning now it was more than double what it originally was upon release, which was the main point of this rework. So the radius and bonus damage was the spirit's shining factor. Other than that, it was consistent with the others. This rework was clearly very well thought out, but it was so different from what it was before that I don't think anyone could have predicted how strong it would be until the rework went live. So then, how did these changes ultimately affect the card? Well, it certainly was much better than before, but it would take time for its full power to get recognized. A few weeks after the rework went live, the rates were about average, but they would continue to trickle up. It was considered to be a pretty strong card, but nothing game-breaking. However, there was one significant problem with it that made some players perceive it as being way too strong, and this was thanks to its 2.5 tile radius. I didn't mention it earlier because I wanted to emphasize how big it was now. This radius meant that it could fully counter a center-placed goblin barrel. If the spirit jumped on any of the 3 goblins, it would always hit the other 2, instantly taking them all out. This meant you could fully counter a 3 elixir card for just 1 elixir, which was a huge plus. This made it nearly impossible to win as a Goblin Barrel player if you were going against the Fire Spirit. There really just wasn't any counterplay, because spells that could be placed anywhere like Zap and Snowball wouldn't take it out anymore. Tricky Barrels wouldn't work because the Fire Spirit was a troop that would just follow wherever the barrel was placed. You didn't need to have good timing or placement. It was so easy for anyone to do. As you could imagine, this made Goblin Barrel players pretty upset. The Fire Spirit alone pretty much killed the entire Logbait archetype. Even though the spirit itself wasn't insanely popular, it prevented Logbait players from being able to consistently win battles and push high, since it essentially acted as a wall to those players. Other than that though, the Fire Spirit seemed pretty balanced. I don't think Supercell really intended for this interaction to happen, so it would likely be changed in the next set of balance changes. As for the decks you would see Fire Spirit in for the meantime however, you saw it paired a lot with the brand new Goblin Drill, which sometimes included wall breakers. This is primarily what you saw it in throughout this period, but you also occasionally saw it replacing the Ice Spirit in the popular Hog Earthquake deck that was going around. It was really just a good high pressure card that was useful in cycle decks for chipping. It was really solid because it did more damage to towers than a Fireball for just 1 elixir, meaning you'd either get a lot of cheap damage or get some easy positive elixir trades. It really seemed to be in a fantastic position. The rework had overall been very successful. The next set of balance changes wouldn't arrive until September 6th, 2021. And here, the Fire Spirit would get a very small nerf. a simple radius decrease of 2/10 of a tile, specifically meant only to affect the interaction against Goblin Barrel. Now, it was still technically possible to hit all 3 goblins against a center-placed Goblin Barrel with a single Fire Spirit, but to do that now, you would need to nudge one of the goblins closer to the middle with something like skeletons to make the radius of the spirit reach the other 2. However, since it took at least 2 elixir to pull this off, it was no longer special, since something as simple as a log could always fully counter a Goblin Barrel for 2 elixir. The Goblin Drill also got nerfed in this set of balance changes, which sucked for the spirit because it had been working so well with it. The rates would decrease to be just about average once the balance changes went live, but it was hardly seen in any top decks. It was kind of just sometimes replacing other spirits in already established decks. Its power would begin to get more recognized in November, however, thanks to the release of Champions. Champions introduced a new 3-card cycle strategy, so cycle cards were in higher demand. This Royal Hog Archer Queen deck was probably the most iconic one. This one exploded in popularity and would remain in the meta for a while, but you also saw the Fire Spirit being implemented in pretty much every kind of cycle deck. Hog Rider, Minor Control, you name it. Fire Spirit just fit a highly demanded role of being a very cheap, strong pressure card. At this point, it didn't really seem to be used as a defensive card against swarms. It mainly seemed to be used just to get to a better card or to get chip damage. So at this point, the radius stat seemed to barely matter at all. It's not like a card has to fit any specific role, but that's what Seth emphasized when talking about a potential buff/rework a while back. So it seems like the card strayed away from its intended purpose. And because of the Goblin Barrel, they really can never buff the radius again, in case they wanted to rework it to have a much bigger radius but do less damage or something like that. At this point, however, that didn't even seem necessary. The card was so popular at this point, the Ice Spirit was getting boxed out to an extent because of it. So for the 3rd set of balance changes in a row, the Fire Spirit would be changed. On December 7th, 2021, its jump range would be reverted back to 2 tiles, meaning more cards would actually be able to take it out in a one-on-one interaction. It definitely made the card a lot less annoying. Now hopefully this would give some room to the other spirits to breathe a bit more. The rates obviously took another hit after the balance changes went live, but it was certainly still competitively viable. That brings us to 2022. You still saw the Fire Spirit played in the same decks it had already been working well in, especially this one specific Archer Queen Royal Hogs deck we already talked about. It had seemed to settle in a great spot, perhaps never needing a balance change again. But as the months went by, the rate slowly increased again. The decks that had been thriving in were continuously thriving, and you even saw it squeezing its way back into Expo. But perhaps the biggest cause to this continuous rise was the Mighty Miner. You saw the Fire Spirit present in multiple popular Mighty Miner decks, and even during that rise, it was still present in multiple meta Archer Queen decks. This one in particular was rising towards the end of May into June, but despite his growing popularity, the Fire Spirit really only got complaints from competitive players. If you were more of a casual mid-ladder player, you probably didn't mind this card too much, but Supercell does try to appeal to both groups to an extent when it comes to balance changes, and with the surge of popularity it saw in the first half of 2022, a nerf was justified. So on August 2nd, 2022, the Fire Spirit would receive the final nerf and thus the final change it would ever receive, a simple damage reduction of 9%, meaning it actually now did less damage than an old Fire Spirit from the trio pre-rework. This was a very specific number which I think was very smartly chosen. With this damage reduction, it would still one-shot goblins at an equal level, as well as take out Zappies, Flying Machine, Magic Archer, Mother Witch, or Skeleton Dragons with the assistance of the Royal Delivery. But now it would no longer take out Lava Pups. Also before, a Fire Spirit could fully take out Wall Breakers with the assistance of the Tower, but now with the reduced damage, it would take 2 tower shots to take each of them out instead of 1. This nerf was definitely going to cause some damage, but it was the last bit of toning down the card needed to be balanced once and for all. After the changes went live, Fire Spirit's rates settled back down to be statistically very balanced. These rates weren't stable, but I'm not going to cover every single brief uptick and downfall from this last balance change all the way until 2024. For a while after the nerf, you still saw it appearing in this trending Giant Skeleton Hog Rider deck, which had been steadily popular for a few months by this point. Fire Spirit was in a great position now. Its rates were never exceeding standard boundaries, but consistently seeing at least some play in the competitive scene. Sometimes he was in the meta, sometimes he wasn't. It was just a matter of the overall environment and if and when he could play his part well. And I think that's an okay spot for a card to be in. As we take a look at his performance in 2023, it's safe to say that he remained viable, but his rates were typically on the lower end of usage. Around April and May, Archer Queen Royal Hogs made a small comeback which helped the Fire Spirit, but other than that, there weren't really any top meta decks that included it throughout the entire year. Its purpose was just a bit more niche than most cycle cards. It could be argued that maybe it deserved a small buff, but since it was never really dead at any point, Supercell decided to leave it alone for the entire year, which I think was the right approach. Going into 2024, the rates were trickling down to a point where it suggested the card was borderline unviable. But this would all change in March 2024. The Goblin Drill was a card that we talked about working very well with the Fire Spirit in the past, but for a while up to this point, it had been very unpopular. It got a massive rework in March, bringing it back into the meta. Goblin Drill wasn't just viable now, it was quite strong, and Fire Spirit found a huge new wave of success in this new Goblin Drill meta, hitting the highest rates it's had since before its nerf nearly 2 years ago by this point. But the Fire Spirit was really only seen in Goblin Drill decks, so it was clearly just riding the popularity of this card. It couldn't ensure long-term stability, but it proves that the Fire Spirit still has a lot of potential to thrive. Even as of recently, there's been some top players succeeding with new variants of Royal Hog Archer Queen decks, but it seems like it will typically remain as a slightly underused niche card. But again, that's totally fine. Not every card is or should necessarily have equal rates to each other. So now I hope you can understand why I said this card had one of the most interesting journeys of any card. And despite it receiving a massive overhaul along with so many changes, I honestly think Supercell handled this card pretty well. There were so many challenging factors and obstacles to cross when it came to balancing throughout the years, but despite that, they ended up turning it into a pretty healthy card, which is not something I'm used to saying in these videos. The Fire Spirit, I gotta say, is in an overall pretty healthy position today. Its rates may not suggest that all the time, but it's a card that time and time again has proven its strength, even if it seems weak at times. Also, you may have noticed that I stopped talking about the Furnace partway through this video, and that's because it actually had a rework in December 2021 that was pretty detrimental. It just never really recovered after that. For a while, it's had some of the worst rates of any card in Clash Royale. So it doesn't really seem like it's holding the Fire Spirit back from any potential changes at this point, because they clearly don't care if that card is viable anymore. And I think the Fire Spirit rework in a way kind of ruined it. That card was supposed to have 2 weak spirits per wave, but now it's totally different. I said originally that I felt like the Furnace was holding back the Fire Spirits back in the day, but now I think it's the complete opposite. Furnace never really needed that June 2021 rework. The Fire Spirits did, but I think most people would prefer seeing the solo spirit than a building that spawns waves of them any day, because people do not like spawners. But I do want to point out one reason as to why it seems like Supercell may have a bias against the Fire Spirit, and here's why. If you don't know, in Clash Royale, every single troop card has a little model that appears above it if you pull up its stats, with the exception of only one, the Fire Spirit. Every troop, old and new, including every other spirit, has one, but in the Fire Spirit's case, there's simply nothing there. I don't know why there's an arbitrary exception here. It's so strange. They've even created the perfect model for it in a banner already, so I don't know why they wouldn't just apply it here. But anyway, let me know what you think about the Fire Spirit and what card's history you would like to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.